Check out FlipsideGaming.com for all your gaming needs. Use the promo code HEROES to save 10% on all orders over $10 and support the channel at the same time. Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and it's that time of the week again. We're going to recap the results of the major tournaments that occurred over the weekend. We had a Star City Games Open in Dallas. That was a Modern event. There was also a Modern Classic and Standard Classic. We're going to look at the results from those events with a special focus on the Guilds of Ravnica cards that performed well over the weekend. Quickly before we get started, just a fast reminder, if you check out the description below, you'll find a few ways to help support the channel, one of which is our Patreon page. That's linked down there. You're also going to find links to products on Amazon, and once you go through that first link, no matter what you purchase on Amazon, we'll get a small percentage. Finally, Flipside Gaming still offering a promo code for our viewers. Hopefully you can save some cash while you support the channel. They actually just added some classic art playmats to their site. You may want to check those out. They do look really sweet. But as always, thank you not only to the folks that look at those links, but to all the viewers. You all make the channel what it is. I appreciate you all. But let's get into it. We'll begin, as we always do, with Standard. And here's your top 8 for the Star City Games Classic. Coming in first, as well as 7th and 8th, is Golgari Midrange. Although we're going to take a look at the first place deck list and then later the 7th place deck list, you're going to notice that they are actually pretty different. Second place, Mono Red Aggro. Third place is Boros Midrange, although you could argue that's actually a Boros Angels deck. We'll look at that in a moment. Fourth place, Dimir Control. Fifth place, Boros Angels. Sixth place, Esper Control. Now, there's a little more diversity than maybe we saw in the past couple weeks, because Mono Red Aggro only taking second place, still a good finish, but it did not completely dominate the tournament, and that's good to see. Also, Golgari Midrange feels like it's doing a little better than it did maybe week 1, where we saw one come in 7th place in one major tournament and one come in 8th place in another one. Finally, you get one coming in first, as well as a 7th and 8th place finish here. So it looks like that deck is starting to come together finally. So fans of that deck will be happy about that. You also have a couple control builds here. The Boros Angels / midrange decks look like they're pretty strong as well. Let's look at these deck lists. Alright, we'll begin with Golgari Midrange. So here's your first version of this deck, basically. And we'll talk about the Guilds of Ravnica cards in just a second, but you see there's still a lot of cards from the previous meta hanging around here. Some notable ones include Jade Light Ranger, 4 of those. That card's very hot this week financially. You get 4 Llanowar Elves, 4 Merfolk Branchwalkers, 3 Chupacabras. So a lot of cards that are still strong from before. Vivian Reed, that's another card that's been very hot recently. 3 right in the main here. You also get 3 Vraska Relic Seekers. Those were 2 of the bigger movers this past weekend on the Market Watch, as a matter of fact. Let's look at the Guilds of Ravnica influence here, though. 5 cards in the main, you're going to find Doom Whispers, Golgari Findbroker, Assassin's Trophy. Finally, we're seeing Assassin's Trophy show up in some standard top 8s. We knew it was coming, it just was a little slow week 1. Find and Finality, that's proven to really be a strong card. You'll find that in a lot of builds now. In Overgrown Tomb. Out of the sideboard, you find the new Vraska Golgari Queen. You also get another copy of Assassin's Trophy, as well as another copy of Find and Finality. Second place, Mono Red Aggro, a deck that's looked pretty good over the last couple weeks. And I had a friend that ran this last weekend at a PPTQ. He mentioned a couple of things that were interesting, though. He said that he had trouble against the Izzet Spells deck, that he felt he was really mismatched there. And he also had trouble when he did not get Experimental Frenzy, which kind of makes sense because that is such an explosive card. So when you look at some of the older cards that are still hanging around, you see some interesting things here. Of course, 4 Goblin Chain Whirlers, that's never going away. But you get 2 copies of Sarkhan Fireblood in this particular build with 3 Varix Bladewings, a copy of Siege Gang Commander, even a Direfleet Daredevil sneaks in there. And of course you have your Burn Suite with Lightning Strike, Shivan Fire, Shock. And let's look at those Guilds of Ravnica cards. In the main, you get a copy of Legion Warboss, Runaway Steamkin, of course that's been a key card here. Lava Coil shows up, as well as, of course, Experimental Frenzy. Out of the sideboard, you get 3 more copies of Lava Coil and another copy of Experimental Frenzy. Third place deck was Boros Midrange. Like I said, you could argue that this is actually Boros Angels. There's no Shalais in this particular main deck. However, you're going to see in the one in a few moments that they ran Shalai over some of the other cards. But for the most part, these lists were pretty close. Here you have Lyra, of course you have Aurelia as well, and Resplendent Angel, so you do have a lot of angels here. This one is running 4 Rekindling Phoenixes, though, take note of that, right in the main. You get 3 Knights of Grace, a Ajani Adversary of Tyrants, just 1 copy, but I notice you're seeing more and more decks running 1 or 2 of Ajani. I was a little surprised week 1, week 2, we didn't see more of that, but it's starting to take hold now, it looks like. Let's look at the guilds cards. In the main, of course, we mentioned Aurelia already. Justice Strike, Conclave Tribunal, and Sacred Foundry. Out of the sideboard, you find Deafening Clarion. 4th place in the control variant that did the best this week, Dimir Control. Not a Teferi variant, which is pretty interesting. But this has some power behind it. We're going to look at that creature suite in just a second. But again, you're going to see a lot of cards you recognize here. There's Cast Down, Moment of Craving, Vraska's Contempt, 4 of those right there in the main. Let's look at the new cards, though, because there's a lot of them here. 10 cards in the main you're going to find. Blood Operative, Doom Whisperer, Dream Eater, Night Veil Predator, those are your creatures. Ritual of Soot, which has turned out to be an amazing board sweep. Thought Erasure, Disdainful Stroke, Disinformation Campaign, Discovery and Dispersal, and Watery Grave. Out of the sideboard, Thief of Sanity, another Ritual of Soot, Unmoored Ego, and another Disdainful Stroke. 5th place, here's Boros Angels. So here's what I was talking about. This one's running 3 Shalais in the main. You also have 4 Lyras, 3 Aurelias, 4 Resplendent Angels. So maybe it's running a few more Angels. Of course, you don't see the Rekindling Phoenixes in the main. There's 2 in the sideboard, though. So a little different, but not too different. Let's look at the new cards here. Aurelia, of course. Deafening Clarion makes the main deck this time. Justice Strike, Conclave Tribunal, Sacred Foundry. There's actually no new cards in the sideboard this time. 6th place was another control variant, this time Esper Control, but it does play differently. 4 Teferi, Hero of Dominarias. This one's a little more reminiscent of those control builds that we saw in the previous meta. You do get a copy of Chromium the Mutable as well in the main deck. Other than that, you're going to see a lot of familiar cards here. Cast Down, Syncopate, again, 4 Vraska's Contempts, 2 Search for Azcanta, but let's look at the new ones. 6 altogether in the main. Dream Eater, 1 copy there. Ritual of Soot shows up again. Chemister's Insight, Disdainful Stroke, Sinister Sabotage, and Watery Grave. Out of the sideboard, you get another copy of Dream Eater and another copy of Disdainful Stroke. 7th place, let's look at one more Golgari mid-range deck, because like I said earlier, this one actually looks and plays different than the other one that we saw. There are some similarities. You still have your Jadelight Ranger, your Merfolk Branchwalker, but you are finding some differences here, like 4 Stitcher Suppliers, for example. Now, there's also some other big changes when you look at the guilds cards. 8 cards altogether, and there's some different faces here. Plague Crafter, Glowspore Shaman, Golgari Finebroker, Izonai Thousand Eye, Molder Hulk, Necrotic Wound, Fine Infinality, Overgrown Tomb, and actually no new cards in the sideboard this time. We won't look at that 8th place Golgari deck just because it looks like a blending of the 1st and 7th place ones, but let's look at some decks that didn't quite make the top 8 but still performed well. The first one, Abzan Midrange. And this does share colors with Golgari. It's still a mid-range deck, but it does play very differently. It almost feels like a blending of Golgari mid-range and Selesnya tokens a little bit. You're going to find 2 copies of the Immortal Sun, for example. You get 2 Ixalan's Bindings. But then there's also some familiar faces for Jadelight Ranger, for Merfolk Branchwalker. Let's see what influence the new set had. 7 cards altogether. Crawl Harpooner, Knight of Autumn, very popular card in Modern right now. You're going to see that in a few moments. Tristani Discordant, March of the Multitudes, Find Infinality, Overgrown Tomb, and Temple Garden. Out of the sideboard, Hatchery Spider, and 2 copies of Knight of Autumn. Izzet Spells came in 12th place. I like this deck a lot. I do think if it doesn't put up a good result next weekend, like a top 8, I think people might start to lose interest, unfortunately, because I do think it's sweet and actually has a lot of power behind it. Let's look at some of the spells quickly that are sticking around. Things like Lightning Strike, for example, you get 4 ops, of course, Shocks here. Feels more like a burn deck in some ways, but the creature suite is pretty interesting. Let's look at what's going on from the new set. Quite a few cards, 8 altogether. Arclight Phoenix, 4 of in the deck. Huge card here. Goblin Electromancer, Lava Coil, Beacon Bolt, Mission Briefing, Radical Idea, Ionize, and Steam Vents. Out of the sideboard, Rahl is a Viceroy, another copy of Lava Coil, another copy of Beacon Bolt, Disdainful Stroke, and Expansion Explosion. Selesnya tokens, this deck did very well week 1, but I do feel like a lot of people might be leaning towards the Abzan midrange over this build now. But this does look very reminiscent of what we saw week 1, and we'll look at the new cards in a moment, but still I want to point out 3 History of Benalias, 3 Legion's Landings, of course 3 Saproling Migrations. There's a lot going on here. Let's look at the new cards. Venerated Loxodon, District Guide, Amara Soul of the Accord, Tristani Discordant, March of the Multitudes, Conclave Tribunal, Dawn of Hope, Flower and Flourish, and Temple Garden. Out of the sideboard, Knight of Autumn, and 2 more copies of Dawn of Hope. Alright, that does it for Standard. What's going on in the world of Modern? And how much influence is Guilds of Ravnica having? Actually, a lot more than you might expect. You're going to see a number of decks running cards from the new set here. So let's look at the Star City Games Modern Open. This was the big event. First place, 4-color Death Shadow. Second place, as well as third place, was Dredge. Fourth place, Mono Green Tron. Fifth, sixth, and seventh was Humans. Eighth place, Infects. Even though there's still diversity here, I will say this is maybe one of the more narrow events that I've seen in Modern in a while, which is usually a very, very diverse format. This time, though, we do see 3 Humans decks here in the top 8, as well as 2 Dredge. So let's look at some deck lists that had some influence from Guilds of Ravnica. The first was that deck that came in first place, 4-color Death Shadow. Nothing surprising at first here, right? 4 Death Shadows, as you would imagine, 4 copies of Tarmogoyf. That's a card that was a little soft this past week financially, so maybe it rebounds now that it put up such a nice finish here. 2 Liliana of the Vales. You're also going to find things like Fatal Push and Temur Battle Rage, 4 Thought Seizes. A lot of cards that you're used to seeing in decks like this. However, Assassin's Trophy shows up out of the sideboard with 2 copies. So again, you're starting to see this show up in more and more decks as people are trying it out. Alright, let's look at one of these Dredge decks. This is the one that came in second place. And there is one card we'll look at in just a moment from the new set, which is really pushing Dredge, making it better. Now, aside from that, I'm not going to count Narco Amoeba. Of course, that was already in the format prior to the reprinting. Same thing with Shocklands when it comes to Modern. But the one card I do want to point out, Creeping Chill. All these Dredge decks are running 4 copies right in the main. This is incredible for this particular build. Out of the sideboard, again, you're going to find 2 copies of Assassin's Trophy as well. I wanted to look at the 6th place Humans deck because it does do something that not all the others are doing, although this is something I saw about a week ago. Tajik Legion's Edge. There's 2 copies in this particular deck list. Now, we saw a deck that performed well a week ago running 1 copy. This one's running 2. Other variants aren't running any, but they actually might be running some other new cards, and we'll see that in a moment. Out of the sideboard, 2 copies of Night of Autumn. Alright, let's look at a couple decks that just missed the top 8 that were interesting. Izzet Spells was one of them to me. This is kind of a sweet build. You're going to notice in the main deck there's one really big card from the new set. It's Arclight Phoenix. This card spiked pretty aggressively this past week financially, and it's because not only of its standard play, but also the modern play it's been seeing. A lot of decks running 4 of these. Now, one of these decks will have to put up a top 8 at some point, or again, people will lose interest, but I do think there's a lot of potential here. I've seen some of these aggro decks not only running Arclight Phoenix, but also some other new cards like Runaway Steamkin, for example. This is definitely something you'll want to keep an eye on. Bat Company came in 22nd place, again a deck we're familiar with, but one big difference. It's running 2 copies of Night of Autumn in the main, as well as 2 in the sideboard. Alright, let's move on to the Modern Classic. A little more diversity here, although Humans still comes in first, as well as 6th place. Second place, Scred Red. Third and 5th place was Grixis Whir of Invention. 4th place, Azorius Control. 7th place, Amulet Titan. And 8th place, Eldrazi Tron. Now, overall, you see, okay, Humans still doing very well, but you do get some different variations of decks here. Grixis Whir of Invention has actually been pretty popular recently. That's definitely one to watch going forward. So again, let's look at some deck lists that has some new cards in them. And we'll begin with the Humans deck. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. Obviously, it's very similar to the other Humans deck we looked at, but there are some differences when it comes to Guilds cards. This time we find 2 sideboard cards in the form of Plague Crafter and Night of Autumn. Okay, let's skip ahead now to 11th place and look at the Jund build as we look at a few more decks that had some influence from Guilds of Ravnica. Now, one thing about Jund, a lot of people were speculating it could get better thanks to Assassin's Trophy. Well, this is maybe the first sign of that. It's not a bad deck, it's just a little inconsistent. It'll put up a great result, then you don't hear about it for a few weeks, then it comes back again. One thing I do want to point out, though, before we get into the trophies, 4 Bloodbraid Elves, okay, that's normal. 3 Dark Confidant. A lot of these decks are running less and less Bobs recently. This one is running 3 in the main, though. 4 Tarmogoyf, so again, Goyf has a pretty decent weekend. 3 Liliana of the Veil, 1 Liliana of the Last Hope, all in the main. But this is what we came here for. Assassin's Trophy also played in the main deck, 3 copies. Scred Dragons. This came in 12th place. I thought this was kind of a cool build, right? Especially for Modern. You don't always expect something like this, but Sarkhan Fireblood, 3 of those, 3 Chandra Torch of Defiance, so maybe a new home for her in Modern. You're going to find a number of dragons with Stormbreath Dragon, Thunderbolt Hellkite, 4 Glorybringers are here. Pretty crazy stuff, but what I wanted to point out, 2 copies of Risk Factor in the main. We did not see that in the mono red deck that top 8 the standard event this past weekend, although other variants of that deck do run Risk Factor. Well, it is showing up quite a bit in modern, so a couple copies here. We also find Goblin Crater Maker in the sideboard. Burn came in 13th place, a lot of cards you're familiar with here. You're going to find Lightning Bolts and Lightning Helix, Lava Spike, Rift Bolt, but you also find something else. Copy of Risk Factor in the main, as well as a copy in the sideboard. Bant Spirits, this is the last deck we'll look at. It came in 14th place, but out of the sideboard, 2 copies of Knight of Autumn. Alright, with that being said, those are the tournament results. Now, a little bit later in the week, we are going to do a special edition of the Magic the Gathering Market Watch to look at the Guilds of Ravnica cards and just see how they are moving after this weekend's performance. Of course, next Saturday, we'll do our regular edition of the Market Watch, as we always do. Also next weekend, standard GPs come back. So I would expect that that's going to be a big week financially for some of these cards where the rubber kind of meets the road. Anyone who's been holding off, waiting to buy into a deck, that's probably going to be the point where they decide what they're going to play. A lot of times it's the Pro Tour weekend, but the Pro Tour isn't going to happen for a couple more weeks. It's happening a little bit later in the season. So next weekend, I think, is going to be the big weekend for the standard cards when it comes to actual financial movement up or down. But until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.